intelligencesquared.com.
As you may know, the crisis has generated a shortage of jobs for most people, but an excess of demand for economists, and as well as a large number of books about the crisis. Most of these books about the crisis are journalistic accounts of what happened in the 4 days that Bear Stearns went down, or the 4 days of when Lehman Brothers went down, who said what would have happened if he hadn't gone to the bathroom at a critical moment in the negotiations, how things might have been different. This book is a little bit different from that. It's really about the battle of ideas, the ideas that led to the deregulation, that really provided the background for the crisis, the ideas that actually underlay some of the kinds of financial, so-called innovations in the financial market, and the ideas that have played an important role in shaping the responses in the United States and Europe to the crisis. The kinds of ideas that you just referred to about the fact that markets are not always self-adjusting, self-correcting, that they are not always efficient, play a really central role in this book. Now, in some sense, you could have said, one could have said, didn't we have the Great Depression some 75 years ago when we learned that markets didn't always work perfectly? But in a period of 75 years, people forget. And most of the people alive then are not alive now. So the lessons of the Great Depression did get forgotten, and a new generation grew up that came to believe, particularly within the economics profession, that markets were really quite were efficient and worked in this beautiful way. What was interesting was that while these ideas became very popular among some circles, some policy circles, and among some parts of the economics profession, within other parts of the economics profession, there were a focus on another set of ideas, which try to explain why it was, to put it in one way, why Adam Smith's invisible hand that argued that markets led as if by an invisible hand, pursuit of self-interest led as if by an invisible hand to economic efficiency. The reason that the invisible hand often seemed invisible was that it wasn't there. That, in fact, markets that are marked by asymmetric and imperfect information often are, or in general are not, efficient. That there are a whole set of problems associated with what we call agency, when people work on behalf of others, the separation of ownership and control, which is pervasive in 21st century economies, but not in 19th century economies, that these problems of externalities, as I say, are central to an understanding of the functioning of modern economies, and why some of the simplistic beliefs about what I call market fundamentalism fail. So while the book is really, as I say, really about this battle of ideas, what I try to do in the book is to use this as a way of trying to explain what caused the crisis, what we did in response, what we should have done, why what we did didn't work as well as one would have hoped, and what there is, what we should be doing now, both in the short run, but in the longer run, to address some of the deeper problems in our economies. One of the challenges facing any interpretation of this crisis is that there are many explanations, many people, many stories about what caused the crisis. And everybody can agree, especially in England, that this was a crisis wears a Made in USA label, and that we exported our toxic mortgages, in fact, we send a thank you note all the time to Europe for buying so many of our toxic mortgages. We sold about 40% of them to Europe. And had it not been for that, the downturn in the US would have been much worse. But we have to ask the question, yes, it's clear that the underlying the failure was the failure in the financial markets, but why did the financial markets fail to do what they're supposed to do? They're supposed to do a very simple societal function: allocate capital, manage risk, run a payments mechanism, do it all at low transaction cost. They didn't do that, except for the last where they used high transaction cost, but they misallocated capital, they mismanaged risk. Why didn't they do that? Why didn't they do what they should have done? Well, one of the answers is that they had incentives to be short-sighted, to undertake excessive risk. If you look at the incentive structures, most economists would have said it should have led to bad behavior. And in fact, in the years before the crisis, I was a little worried, because the one thing that economists agree on is incentives matter. And here, the financial system created incentives for this short-sighted behavior and excessive risk-taking, and the full manifestation wasn't realized. And if that didn't happen, it would have meant that we'd have to write our textbook and say incentives don't matter. But fortunately, we've had the crisis, and we've seen that that incentives do matter, and people behave in the way that they have incentives. Well, this raises an issue that I describe in my book a little bit, peeling back an onion. Every time you get an explanation, it necessitates asking another question. Market economies are supposed to, one of the strengths of the market economy is that they're supposed to produce good incentives. So they're supposed to provide incentives for people to behave in the right way. And they didn't. And the answer, the question is, why was that? And the easy answer, and it gives a large part of the explanation, are problems of corporate governance, separation of ownership and control. And then you have to ask a further question, why was that? And to get all these answers, you'll have to buy the book. So clearly, at the center of the failure was the failure of the financial system, but clearly there were other factors contributing. The regulators are supposed to stop the bad behaviors that occurred, and they didn't do that. And you ask, why was that? And two explanations come to mind. One of them was that economists provided them arguments for not doing what they should have done. Economists, many economists, not this one, but others, provided an argument that said that you don't need regulation. That was the ideas I talked about before. In addition, it was politics. There were many people that were doing very well under the system of deregulation. And enormous political campaign contributions in the United States. We have 5 lobbyists from the financial industry for every congressman, full time, pestering every congressman to make sure that he passes the laws that they want. So in that sense, it's not a surprise what happened. Well, this gives you a couple of the key factors in causing underlying the crisis. A financial system that didn't do what it was supposed to do, regulators that didn't do what they were supposed to do. And since I've only been given 10 to 12 minutes, I'm trying to go through this very staccato-like. What was the response? Well, there were 3 parts of the response. The first was a stimulus. And when Obama got elected, it was good that he finally got around to it. Bush didn't do anything about this. But it was too small, and it was not well designed. In the book, we talk about the idea that jokingly called the Krugman-Stiglitz doctrine that corresponds to the Powell doctrine, that when you have a problem, you have to attack it with overwhelming force, and that we should have done more. This is a statement not made with hindsight, but actually said at the time, and interestingly, even Obama's chief economic advisor, Christine Romer, said that needed to be a much larger stimulus. But unfortunately, Obama was not given that choice. He was given a choice between two much smaller stimuluses. And what has happened is not a surprise. The unemployment rate has grown. It's about 10% now. But that doesn't fully capture the weaknesses in our labor market. Almost 1 out of 5 Americans who would like a full-time job can't get one now. The unemployment rate among particular groups is gotten much higher. Among, for instance, males, particularly working-age males. If you look at particular socioeconomic groups, among Afro-American youth males, the unemployment rate now is 1 out of 2. These are, just phenomenal statistics. And for the first time in the United States, we are beginning to have a problem of long-term unemployment. About more than 40% of those who are unemployed have been unemployed for more than a half a year, which means that as the longer they're unemployed, their savings gets depleted, their job skills get depleted, the prospects of getting a good job in the future diminish. And so we are creating, particularly when we have long periods of youth unemployment, real problems for the future. This is one problem. The stimulus has not been large enough. The second problem is mortgages. I said before we did anything about the mortgages, which came late in the game, that the massive money we were spending on the bank bailout was like a mass blood transfusion to a patient dying from internal hemorrhaging without doing anything about the internal bleeding. Finally, Obama did something about it, but what he did was, again, too little and not well enough designed. The fundamental problem were the very large number of mortgages that were underwater. Here, the essential problem is the people in the financial sector did not want to admit that they had done bad lending, that they had lent on the basis of a bubble. The bubble broke, prices came down by about a third, and the result of that is that 25% of Americans with mortgages owe more on their homes than the value of their home. They have negative equity. The result of this is a massive wave of foreclosures, which is getting worse, not better. So we expect in 2010, 2.5 to 3.5 Americans will lose their homes, and with that, most of them will lose their life savings. That's larger than the 2 million that lost their home in 2009 and almost 2 million in 2008. So we have on our hands a major social problem as well as an economic problem. And it also illustrates that something is not working right about the way that markets, the way we teach market economics. Supply is supposed to equal demand. Here we have a process of we're creating, at the same time, we have vacant homes and large numbers of homeless people. And something's not working about the economic system. Well, unfortunately, when Obama went to address the problem of mortgages, he did nothing about the problem of these underwater mortgages. That would have necessitated writing down the value of the mortgages. I argued for something I call a homeowner's Chapter 11, a restructuring of their debt. But if we had done that, the banks would have had to face up to their bad lending, and the financial sector did not want that to happen. The third part of what we did, and the one that was the beginning of the attention, were the bank bailouts. Massive, expensive. When we reformed America, and this is true in most other countries, when we reformed our welfare program in 1996, we said if you get money on welfare, we put conditions. You have to either look for a job or go into training. When we put the banks on welfare, which is what we were doing in effect, we put no conditions. We said, oh, you've performed so well recently that we'll just trust you. But as we were putting money into the banks, they were putting money out in the form of dividends and bonuses. Bonuses for record losses. I sometimes joke to my students and say, well, it was just a sign error. They thought losses and positive didn't make much difference, and so they gave them record bonuses for these record losses. Worse, we should have recognized that part of our financial system was doing what it was supposed to do. Part of our financial system was really exceptional around the world. Our venture capital firms that were providing finance to new enterprises like Google were doing their job. But those were not the firms that got money and that got support. 140 American banks were shut down last year, but all small banks, many of them providing credit to create new jobs and create new enterprises. So those were shut down with the money poured into the gambling casinos. And we are resulting in a more concentrated banking system, less competitive, higher interest rates, bigger spread between borrowing rate and lending rate. Well, I've been told I have to stop. And let me just say that we're not going to be out of this crisis very quickly. And to highlight that, it's just one simple observation, and then I'll sit down. What had supported the US economy and the global economy to a large extent before the crisis was America's consumer. We had a bubble in the United States that allowed Americans to consume beyond their means. The savings rate in the United States went down, the household savings rate went down to zero. The country as a whole, the richest country in the world, was living beyond its means. Now that that bubble has broken, people are not going to be able to live to that style, and they started to save. Good for the long run, but in the short run, the fact that they're saving means that they're not spending. And the fact that they're not spending means that demand in the United States, and in some sense globally, is weaker. In many of the developing countries, there's the same problem. There are enormous volatility, problems of the way the IMF and US Treasury managed the East Asia crisis, the time of the last global financial crisis, meant that countries lost their economic sovereignty, policies, just the opposite of the kind of policies that were pursued in the United States and Europe were forced on these countries. The prime minister of one of these countries said to me, you know, we were in the class of '97. We learned what happened if you don't have enough reserves. And so he and many of the other countries started to build up the reserves. Again, good for their financial security, but bad for global aggregate demand. And one of the things that will be emerging out of this crisis is the realization that countries that have bigger reserves did better. So there'll be an even greater demand for savings, and that will again reduce global aggregate demand. And so we are facing a situation where we have failed really to reform our global economic system. We have failed to reform our regulatory system, failed to provide the kind of economic system that would provide stability and security. And the result of that is that these economic weaknesses are going to persist, and some of the manifestations of the flawed ways of addressing the crisis are already becoming apparent.